She was humiliated the moment she handed over her ID at the base gate. A young lieutenant laughed and said, "You call this military ID? What did you do, glue it together?" The junior soldiers whispered, mocking her as a knockoff James Bond, and prepared to confiscate the badge. But then, the scanner rejected access, triggered a red alert, and displayed a forgotten symbol, a serpent curled around a compass wiped from the system 7 years ago. And when that symbol glowed, when the system spoke the words Phantom 03, everyone fell silent. Sarah Lee stood at the checkpoint of Greystone Military Base, her golden blonde hair slipping from a loose ponytail catching the early morning sun. Her white t-shirt was tucked into plain jeans, and her khaki jacket hung loosely over her shoulders, frayed at the cuffs. She carried an old leather pouch, its edges worn soft from years of use. The air was thick with the smell of asphalt and coffee, the base humming with the clatter of boots and radios. Lieutenant Dillon, a wiry guy with a cocky grin, held her ID up like it was a prop in a comedy show. "Cheap fake. Who even makes IDs this old and ragged?" he said, waving it for the crowd. A younger soldier, his uniform still stiff from the store, chimed in, "What you think you're, James Bond?" Laughter rippled through the checkpoint heads, craning to see the woman who dared show up with a tattered card. Sarah didn't flinch. Her hands stayed steady, her eyes calm like she'd heard worse. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Go ahead. Scan it." Before we dive deeper, if this story's grabbing you, maybe you've felt that sting of being laughed at, counted out, judged for how you look or where you're from, can you do me a quick favor? Pull out your phone, hit that like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It keeps us going, sharing stories like Sarah's that remind us we're stronger than the world thinks. All right, let's get back to it. Dillon smirked, flipping the ID between his fingers like it was a playing card. He slid it into the scanner, expecting a quick rejection. The machine hummed, then froze. A red light pulsed. A sharp tone, high and unfamiliar, cut through the morning chatter. Code zeros and ghost clearance triggered flashed across the screen. That serpent and compass symbol glowed almost alive, its edges sharp against the dull monitor. Dillon's grin slipped. He tapped the screen, then scanned again. Same tone, same symbol. The soldiers behind him went quiet, their coffee cups hovering midair. This isn't in the database," Dillon muttered, his voice cracking just enough to betray his confidence. Sarah stood there, hands in her pockets, her face unreadable. The checkpoint felt smaller, now the air heavy with something nobody could name. A captain pushed through the crowd. Heller, a tall guy with a buzz cut and a voice that sounded like he practiced shouting in the mirror. "What's the holdup?" he snapped, snatching the ID from Dillon's hand. He held it up, squinting at the faded laminate. "Anyone with ghost clearance wouldn't be applying to shelve records," he said, his tone thick with disdain. He looked Sarah up and down, her plain clothes, her scuffed sneakers, the way she stood without fuss or flair. "Let me guess, watched one too many spy movies?" The soldiers laughed again, louder, feeding off Heller's energy. A private in the back, his face still soft with youth, called out, "Real operatives don't walk in here like this. Total fake." Dillon stepped closer, ready to confiscate the card. Sarah's eyes flicked to him, then back to Heller. She didn't speak, but her silence wasn't weak. It was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Dillon reached for the ID, but Sarah moved first. Not fast, not showy, just smooth, like she'd done it 1,000 times. She took the card from Heller's hand, her fingers brushing his for a split second. She pressed her thumb to the serpent emblem, and a faint blue light pulsed from it, soft but sharp like a heartbeat. The scanner beeped louder now. "Retinal locked access," pending, it announced. In the control room, red lights flickered on, casting shadows across the walls. A mechanical voice echoed, "Subject Velvet Phantom Operative confirmed." The laughter died. Soldiers exchanged glances, their boots shifting on the concrete. Heller's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching like he wanted to grab something, anything to take control. Sarah slipped the ID back into her pouch, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was giving them time to catch up. Lieutenant Colonel Randall stormed in, his boots hitting the ground like he meant to crack it. He was broad, his face flushed, his uniform pressed to a razor's edge. "What's going on here?" he roared, glaring at Dillon, who fumbled for words. Randall's eyes landed on Sarah, then the ID on the desk. "I'm not scanning that piece of junk," he said, slamming his hand down so hard the scanner rattled. "Detain her." Dillon hesitated, his hand hovering near Sarah's arm, but Randall cut him off. "I'll take full responsibility. Just another wannabe playing dress-up." The soldiers nodded, some smirking again, ready to drag her out. Sarah stood her ground, her voice low, sharp enough to slice through the noise. "I expected more intelligence from this base," she said. The words landed like a slap, not loud but precise. Randall's face twitched, his eyes narrowing like he wasn't sure whether to shout or step back. Then the system took over. A voice blared from every screen, override activated. Subject 03 authorized. The base doors clicked, unlocking in unison. Monitors flashed, "Welcome Phantom 03. Dylan let go of Sarah's arm like it was electrified. Randall froze, his hand still raised, his mouth half open. The soldiers stared, their smirks gone, replaced by something closer to fear. Sarah adjusted her jacket, the motion small but deliberate, like she was brushing off their words. Randall's voice cracked as he spoke. You're one of the final 3, he said barely above a whisper. The checkpoint was silent now, the only sound the hum of the scanner and the faint creak of Sarah's pouch as she tucked it into her pocket. 3 rookie soldiers lingered near the back, their uniforms too big for their frames, their faces a mix of bravado and nerves. They whispered, thinking she couldn't hear. It's probably a hoax, one said, his voice low but not low enough. They say the Phantom unit vanished. Nobody came back. Another nodded, leaning closer. Maybe she's just propaganda, a morale stunt. Sarah paused, her hand resting on her pouch. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto theirs, not angry, just steady. If I didn't survive, she said, her voice calm, then who exactly is standing in front of you? The rookies froze, their faces paling. One dropped his gaze to the floor, his hands fidgeting. Sarah turned back her steps, even like she hadn't just silenced them with a single line. Boots echoed down the corridor, heavy and deliberate. General Charles Graham stepped into view, his 3 stars catching the fluorescent light. He was older, his face etched with lines that spoke of battles nobody talked about. He removed his cap, holding it against his chest, and nodded at Sarah. Phantom 03, he said, his voice steady but soft. The last time we received your signal was near the frozen border. He paused, his eyes searching her face. If it weren't for you, Zone Z9 would have been wiped from the map. He turned to the room, his gaze hard now. She's not just an agent. She's the reason any of you are still standing here. The soldiers didn't move. Dylan's hands shook his coffee cup, forgotten on the desk. Randall looked away, his shoulders stiff like he was trying to disappear into his uniform. Sarah didn't react to Graham's words. She just stood there, her hands loose at her sides, her face calm. The checkpoint felt different now, smaller, like the walls were closing in. Graham stepped closer, his voice dropping. We thought you were gone, Agent Lee, he said. 7 years. No signal. No trace. Sarah's eyes flicked to him, then drifted to a photo pinned to the wall. A group of soldiers, one face circled in red, faded from time. Her fingers tightened on her pouch for a moment, then relaxed. Graham followed her gaze, his expression softening. You carried them all, he said, almost to himself. Every single one. The room stayed quiet, the tension thick enough to choke on. The soldiers who'd laughed earlier now avoided her eyes, their boots scuffing the floor. Dylan kept staring at the scanner like it had betrayed him. Heller shifted his weight, his earlier swagger gone, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Randall stood frozen, his face a mix of shame and confusion, like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all a mistake. Sarah didn't look at them. She adjusted her jacket again, the same slow motion, and started walking toward the inner gate. The soldiers parted without a word, their movements stiff, like they were afraid to get too close. As Sarah moved toward the gate, a comms officer, Sergeant Lyle, leaned out from the control booth, his voice sharp with mockery. He was lanky, his glasses smudged his smirk wide as he waved a clipboard. Hey, clerk girl, you forgot to sign in. Or do you think your little magic badge gets you out of paperwork? The soldiers nearby chuckled, some nudging each other, enjoying the new jab. Lyle stepped closer, holding the clipboard like a shield. Look at her, thinks she's too good for protocol. Probably can't even spell security. Go back to your desk job, sweetheart. He tossed the clipboard onto the desk, letting it clatter, his eyes daring her to react. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the gate's handle. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Lyle's, and said, You'll need more than a clipboard to understand this. The words were soft, but they cut, and Lyle's smirk faltered, his hands twitching as the crowd's laughter died. As she passed a clerk at the desk, fumbled with a stack of papers, dropping one. It was a memo stamped with the serpent and compass symbol, the ink still fresh. Sarah glanced at it, her eyes narrowing for a split second, then kept moving. The clerk scrambled to grab at his hands, shaking his glasses slipping down his nose. Behind her, the whispers started again, but they were different now, nervous, fragmented. "That's her," one soldier muttered. "The one from the blackout." Another shook his head, his voice low. "No way. She's too normal." Sarah didn't turn back. She just kept walking, her pouch swinging slightly at her side, her steps steady against the concrete. Inside the base, the hallways were stark white walls, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, the air heavy with the scent of metal and disinfectant. Sarah moved through them like she'd walked them 1,000 times. Her shoulders relaxed, but her eyes sharp, taking in every detail. A few officers passed her their glances, lingering too long, their steps slowing as they tried to place her. One started to speak. His hand half raised, then thought better of it and hurried on. Sarah didn't acknowledge them. She stopped at a door marked Records, her hand resting on the handle. For a moment she stood there, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening to a sound nobody else could hear, a hum, a whisper, a memory. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The records room was a maze of file cabinets and computers, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. A woman sat at the desk, her glasses low on her nose, her fingers tapping impatiently on a keyboard. "You the new clerk?" she asked, barely looking up. Sarah nodded, setting her pouch on the counter with a soft thud. The woman, Marla, her name tag read, squinted at her, then pointed to a towering stack of files. "Start there. Don't mess it up." Sarah didn't reply. She just pulled the first file and started reading, her fingers moving carefully over the pages like she was handling something fragile. Marla watched her for a moment. Her lips pursed, then muttered something about newbies and went back to her screen. Hours passed, the room quiet except for the rustle of paper and the faint hum of the computers. Sarah worked steadily, sorting files, her movements precise, almost mechanical. Every now and then she'd pause, her eyes lingering on a name, a date, a faded photograph clipped to a page. One file had a picture of a young man, his face serious, a faint scar above his eye. Sarah's hand stopped, her fingers hovering over the photo, her breath catching for just a second. Then she closed the file and moved on, her face calm again. Marla didn't notice, too busy typing, her coffee mug leaving rings on the desk. As Sarah worked, a maintenance worker, Jenkins, poked his head into the room, his broom propped against the wall. He was older, his face weathered, his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Heard about the gate," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. "You really think you can fool a base like this with that old pouch? Looks like something my kid made in shop class." He chuckled, shaking his head, his broom sweeping lazily across the floor. "Bet you're just here to stir up trouble, huh? Go on, admit it, you're no operative." The other clerks glanced up, smirking, waiting for Sarah to crumble. She didn't look at Jenkins. She slid a file into place, her movements slow, and said, "Sweep the floor, Jenkins. It's what you're here for." The room went quiet, Jenkins's chuckle dying, his broom stopping mid-sweep as the clerks exchanged uneasy glances. Outside the base was alive with rumors. In the mess hall, soldiers leaned over their trays, trading half-true stories about the Phantom unit. Heard she took out a whole squad. Single-handed, one said, his voice low like he was afraid she'd hear him. Another shook his head, poking at his food. "Nah, probably just a tech. Some glitch in the system." A third soldier, older, stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on his coffee. He'd seen the memo, the one with the serpent symbol, before it was locked away. He didn't say anything, but his hands gripped the mug a little tighter. Back at the checkpoint, Dylan was still there, his shift dragging on. He stared at the scanner like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Randall had written him up, his voice sharp with frustration, before storming off to his office. Heller was quieter now, keeping his distance from the other officers, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. The memo with the serpent symbol was gone, locked in a safe, but not before a few soldiers had snapped pictures with their phones. By noon, the base was buzzing with questions. Who was she? Why was she here? And why did General Graham bow to her like that? Nobody had answers, but the air felt different now, like a storm was coming. Sarah kept working, her face calm, her hands steady. But there was a moment late in the morning when she stopped. Marla had stepped out for a smoke, leaving Sarah alone in the records room. She pulled a file from the bottom of the stack, one marked Decommissioned Velvet Phantom in faded red ink. She opened it, her fingers tracing the edges of a single page. A roster, names and dates most stamped. KIA. Her eyes landed on one name circled in red, the same face from the photo on the checkpoint wall. She closed the file, her breath catching her fingers lingering on the cover for a moment longer than they should have. Then she slid it back into place, her movements slow like she was carrying something heavy. The door creaked open behind her. Marla was back, her cigarette still smoldering in her hand. "You done with that stack yet?" she asked, her voice sharp. Sarah nodded, not turning around, her hands already moving to the next file. Marla huffed, muttering something about slow workers, and sat back down. Sarah didn't react, but her eyes flicked to the window where a black SUV rolled past its windows, tinted its engine a low rumble. She paused just for a second, then kept working, her face unreadable. By afternoon, the rumors had spread beyond the mess hall. Officers in the command center whispered over their monitors, their voices low. "Heard she's got clearance, even the general doesn't have one," said, glancing at the door. Another shook his head. "No way. She's just a clerk. Probably some mix-up." But they all felt it, the unease, the sense that something bigger was at play. A young tech, barely 20, pulled up the scanner logs from the morning, his fingers shaking as he typed. The screen flashed, Subject 03 Velvet Phantom. He stared at it, then closed the window, his face pale. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Sarah's day went on the records room, a quiet bubble in the chaos of the base. She sorted files, her movement steady, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the door, to the stack of files that seemed to grow no matter how fast she worked. Marla left for lunch, leaving Sarah alone again. She pulled another file, this one unmarked, its edges yellowed. Inside was a single sheet, a handwritten note. Phantom 03, last confirmed, frozen border 2018. Below it, a list of coordinates, a date, and a single word, survivor. Sarah's hand tightened on the page, her knuckles whitening, then relaxed. She slipped the note into her pouch, her face calm like it was just another piece of paper. As Sarah worked, a radio on Marla's desk crackled and a voice broke through. "All personnel stand by for priority alert." The voice was clipped, urgent. "Operative 03 has been verified. Any obstruction will result in immediate disciplinary action." Marla froze her coffee mug halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting to Sarah. The radio continued. "Phantom 03 is to be escorted to secure briefing at 1400 hours. The clerks in the room exchanged glances, their pens stilled, the air heavy with realization. Sarah didn't look up. She kept sorting files, her hands steady, but her jaw tightened slightly, the only sign she'd heard. Marla set her mug down, her hands trembling, and said, You're really her." Sarah didn't answer, just slid another file into place, her silence louder than any response. The base kept moving, but the energy was different now. Soldiers who'd laughed at Sarah that morning now avoided the records room, their steps quickening as they passed. Dylan was reassigned to a desk job by mid-afternoon, his transfer papers stamped with unusual speed. Heller's name started trending online, a grainy video of him mocking Sarah at the gate spreading across X. Sponsors dropped him within hours, his phone buzzing with notifications he didn't answer. Randall was called to a meeting with Graham, his office cleared out by evening, his nameplate gone from the door. The 3 rookies who'd whispered about her were sent to night shifts, their cocky grins replaced by nervous glances. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She worked through the afternoon, her hands steady, her face calm. But there was a moment just before the end of her shift when she stopped. She was alone again. The records room quiet except for the hum of the air vents. She pulled a small photo from her pouch, not the one from the files, but another older, its edges soft from handling. It showed a group of operatives, their faces serious, standing in front of a helicopter. One face was circled, the same scar above the eye. Sarah's thumb brushed over it, her eyes softening, then hardening again. She slipped the photo back into her pouch, her movement slow like she was sealing something away. The door opened and a man stepped in, tall, quiet, his face shadowed by a cap. He didn't speak, but the room changed when he entered, the air heavier like the base itself was holding its breath. Sarah didn't turn around, but her shoulders relaxed like she'd been waiting for him. He walked over, standing beside her, his hands in his pockets. "You didn't have to come here," he said, his voice low, steady like he'd said it before. Sarah didn't look at him. She just kept sorting files, her movement slow. "I did," she said, her voice soft but firm. He nodded like he'd known she'd say that. The man was her husband, though nobody would have guessed it. He didn't wear a ring, didn't carry himself like someone important. But when he stepped into the light, Marla, who'd just come back from her break, froze her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She recognized him not by name, but by the way the air shifted around him. He was the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be heard. He looked at Sarah, then at the files, and said, "They'll figure it out soon enough." Sarah nodded, closing the last file with a soft snap. "Let them," she said, her voice steady, like she was ready for whatever came next. As they stood there, a young officer burst into the room, his face flushed, a tablet in his hands. "Agent Lee," he said, his voice shaking, "we found a sealed transmission in the archives. It's from 2018, addressed to you." He tapped the tablet and a grainy audio played. "Phantom 03, this is command. Your actions saved Z9. We owe you everything." The officer's hands trembled as he looked at Sarah. It was locked under the highest clearance. Nobody knew it existed. Marla's mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor, her eyes wide. Sarah didn't react, just nodded slightly, her fingers brushing her pouch. "I heard it the first time," she said, her voice calm, like the message was just a footnote in her story. The base was a different place by evening. Soldiers whispered in the hallways, their voices low, their eyes darting to the records room. The video of Heller was everywhere now, shared and reshared, his career unraveling with every view. Dylan was gone, his locker emptied, his name already fading from conversation. Randall's office was dark, his meeting with Graham ending with a single sentence, "You're done." The rookies kept their heads down, their night shifts stretching into weeks, their bravado buried under the weight of what they'd seen. Nobody said Sarah's name out loud, but they all knew. She wasn't a clerk. She wasn't a fraud. She was something else, something they'd never understand. Sarah left the records room that night, her pouch tucked under her arm. She walked through the base, her steps, even her face calm. Soldiers watched her pass, their eyes wide, their voices silent. She reached the gate, the same one where they'd laughed at her that morning. The scanner beeped as she passed, the serpent symbol flashing one last time, bright against the dusk. She stepped outside, her husband walking beside her, their shadows long against the ground. The air was cool now, the base quiet, the hum of the checkpoint fading behind them. She'd been judged her whole life by people who saw her, plain clothes, her quiet voice, and thought they knew her worth. She'd carried that weight not because she had to, but because she chose to. She'd walked through their laughter, their scorn, and come out whole, not because she fought, not because she shouted, but because she was Sarah Lee. And that was enough. You've felt it, haven't you? That moment when the world looks at you and sees less than you are. You stood there quiet, not because you were weak, but because you knew. You knew your truth even when they didn't. You weren't alone then. You're not alone now. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.